So this is Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, and Iraq. Of course, they're all China when you come right down to it. Good evening. This is Progressive Soup. David Stevenson, Gene Hislop co-hosts. And we have with us tonight John Kusumi on a return visit, and Mark Albertson, who is not Marv Albert this evening. He's going to be Mark Albertson this evening. All right. Mark, hot potato, get us started. What are we talking about, all these revolutions going on in the world?
Recently, Bahrain seemed to be the next country to have some type of disturbance. That's of importance to the United States because that's the base where the Fifth Fleet is. But the interesting dichotomy about Bahrain is it's actually across the Persian Gulf from Iran, and the king there is Sunni. Yet 70% of the population is Shia. So I'm sure that's a matter of concern too. Yeah, it is. That's a matter of concern.
Now the Sunni and the Shia were if not bitter enemies, certainly at odds with each other in Iraq, for instance. How do they coexist in Bahrain?
Well, I'm sure they're kept under thumb by the Sunni security police. Which is how the king's going to probably stay in power. Plus the U.S. Navy base is there. The U.S. Navy base is there. And push comes to shove, the United States can cut off the Strait of Hormuz because the fleet is there. I mean, that's part of the American strategic presence in the Middle East. We couldn't keep troops in Saudi Arabia. That became untenable. So who was the next place to go to? It was Iraq. So you've got troops in Iraq. You still have troops in Iraq. You've got the American Navy base in Bahrain. You have Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. You have scattered American bases in Central Asia, and obviously the American presence in Afghanistan. Yeah. So how does that make a place like Iran feel surrounded?
Interesting. Now, John organized the China Support Network, so he's been watching revolutions for a long time, back to the days of Mao Zedong, and learning about the Cultural Revolution that took place there and things that have happened in China since then. How are the Chinese looking at the world? Is there anything coming out of China of their observations about what's going on in Egypt and now seems to be spreading?
You may have noticed in the news that the government of China banned the word Egypt or blocked searches. In other words, you can't type in that search term. You can't get information about Egypt in China. So it's very clear that the government of China is very worried. They don't want their people to see a successful uprising against the dictator. And yet, what just happened? A successful uprising against the dictator. So, the thing is that in China, there's more reason for social unrest. Similar conditions, including right now a drought that is driving up the price of food. And, so you end up with an inflation situation. You end up with a regime that has a very narrow base of support. And other reasons for unrest because of brutal repression and crackdowns all the time. So China has, I think, the precursors or preconditions, the ingredients for possible uprising. And in fact, China also has dissidents who work diligently and are all a Twitter. About what has happened in Egypt and going to work on creating the Chinese Revolution that may come along later this year.
So you think they've definitely been re-energized?
Yeah, I think that this is a year of resurgence, really, actually, for the Chinese democracy movement. I happen to know some of what's coming down the pike. I know that the Chinese dissident Tang Baichao, he's going to be out with a new book. And I am planning to go on that publicity tour, with him in a support role. In other words, he wants to be able to, do his outreach and find Americans, in his audience and direct them to join the China Support Network. Okay. So it'll be a year, I think, of growth for my organization and, and for a higher profile on the part of Tang Baichao.
How does Tibet figure in with this right now? I mean, as far as revolutions and independence, obviously they've been fighting for their independence for quite some time. So how does the Dalai Lama and Tibet right now figure into your part of the movement and possible revolution?
The Dalai Lama seems to be almost like one of the strongest Chinese dissidents. In other words, the Tibetan campaigners, they understand, that perhaps their best hope of a change of the policy and the situation in Tibet is if China itself moves over into the column of democracies and gets its own respect for human rights. It means naturally then it will be much easier to resolve the Tibetan situation. And so the campaigners for a free Tibet, they work very often alongside the others. I've mentioned to David on a show before that when you go to like a Chinese consulate or to an embassy to protest, many times you will see several different groups. You will see, not just Chinese dissidents. You will see the Falun Gong, and you will see Tibetans, and you may see Uyghur Muslims, and you may see even the people who want free and independent Taiwan. So the thing is that Beijing really sort of oppresses all of those groups.
Wow.
And so when a good protest happens, you see all of these groups coming together, and we recently had the president of China go through Washington, and so that was one of those times. It's like if you've got a summit meeting, of world leaders, absolutely everyone comes out, and so there was this, park across from the White House that was just filled with, every form of protester against, the Beijing leadership.
Excellent.
Which is interesting because, we've been talking about these other places that are currently, Bahrain and China and Egypt and all these other unstable nations. I'm looking back even further than the Iran protests of earlier last year. I'm looking back to the Burmese protests too. We tend to forget about Little Burma, but again, that was another huge uprising against a corrupt government. So this has been like this real boiling point, and I would say not just this year. This is for the last couple of years. It seems like we've been getting there globally for quite some time. What do you think the next big, besides Egypt, and is Iran going to be the next to really hit the fan, or?
Well, I don't know that I would want to try to place bets on, which nation crosses the finish line first, or I think that there's a serious problem for the regime in Iran, because we know already that the regime is unpopular internationally, and we know that it's unpopular domestically. So right now it's in a pressure cooker. It's being squeezed from all directions. And when you find that the Arab people have lost their fear of dictatorships, then it just suggests that all of those efforts of the security apparatus to stop the protests are thus far not succeeding, and also because of the information revolution, which is sort of a backdrop to recent revolutions, that all those best efforts of the security apparatus can't stop the information from flowing through. So people will be aware of, for example, the success in Egypt, is inspiring Iranians, and the success prior to that was in Tunisia, which inspired the Egyptians. So there's a chain reaction, it looks like, almost happening around the world now.
Now, Mark took us through, when he was on the show earlier, one of the bloodier moments in 20th century history with the war front between the Russians and the Germans. When Germany invaded Russia, and it's just unimaginable how many millions died during that period of time. Is this going to be seemingly at least a more bloodless revolution, or can people accomplish things in a more Gandhian kind of fashion?
Well, I think the thing you have to remember about Gandhi is he did wind up being assassinated in the end. Gandhi is fascinating from the standpoint that he was up against the British Empire. Now, in 1937, Lord Halifax, who was the foreign minister of Britain, went to Germany for a state visit, Berlin, see Adolf Hitler. And in the course of their conversation talking world affairs, the personality of Gandhi shows up here. And even then, Gandhi was somewhat of a problem for the British government. And Hitler told him that, well, there's one way to solving that problem. So I think the important point here is, yes, Gandhi is an important figure. He exuded peace, so on and so forth, which he was the inspiration for Martin Luther King over here, and he wound up being assassinated. So, but the point I'm trying to make is if Gandhi was doing this peaceful revolution against Stalin, what would have happened to him? He would have been off to making ice cakes in Siberia, if not worse. If it was Hitler, he would have been shot. If it was Mussolini, he would have been shot. If it was a Japanese militarist, he'd have been shot.
And there probably were a lot of people that had that demeanor about them, and that
correct.
That's exactly what happened to them.
Well, and even if it was the French, he probably would have been sent to Devil's Island or someplace like that. So what I'm saying is that yes, his mode of using peace to effect a revolution in India, in the long run, worked, but he was dealing with the British and not the Germans, the Russians, the French, the Italians, the Japanese.
Well, the British, I think, in their own way, were pretty brutal.
Oh, they were. I'm not saying they're not.
Somehow
they
he managed to somehow he managed to keep them at bay.
And the other problem was here too. I mean, when you know, now you're opening up a kettle of fish here a little bit, because because when India comes along at 47, so does Pakistan.
Yeah.
Because Pakistan is where a lot of the Muslims went. India is where the Hindus are.
Yeah.
And they still have Muslims in India. It's not that they don't, but it's primarily a Hindu country.
Correct.
So here now you have, again, it's one of those offshoots of these colonial problems. Jack Straw, who was the foreign minister of Britain, said, he said, you would be surprised how many hours I had to spend on issues relating to colonial history 100 years before. He had to take up a lot of time doing this. Iraq is a product of British colonial aspirations and the French.
Yep.
The Israeli-Palestinian problem, Balfour Declaration, 1917, all part of this British colonial era. So we're still digging ourselves out. And the thing is, like what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Bahrain, what's happening in Tunisia, so on and so forth. Will Durant, the great historian, once said, we always seem to look at history the last 24 hours. What about the last 6,000 years? These things take time, and they go through different stages. So right now you're seeing in Egypt, maybe there's a hiatus period here. But if the army doesn't come across for these people, are you going to see a resurgence in violence? Perhaps. So this is not over by a long shot, just like Iraq is not over by a long shot. I mean, people, right now Iraq is off people's radar screens. But Muqtada al-Sadr is back. That could be a problem. And we're supposed to be out of there by the end of the year. Are we? I don't think so.
Speaking of British colonialism, I'm not quite the student of Chinese history, but is it possible that we might be able to trace the communist regime back to British colonialism? Obviously, it's like a backlash against British colonialism at that time.
No, I don't think so. I mean, Britain did have Hong Kong. But the Chinese Communist Party was sort of a clone or a grafted, like an offshoot from the Soviet Communist Party. And I guess you could trace it back to Karl Marx and Engels, right? So that's, what's true about the Communist Party in China is that it is indigenously not Chinese. In other words, it's a foreign influence to begin with. So whenever they're decrying foreign influence, it's pretty damn funny. It's there they are. They're the party that more or less was placed there by the Soviet Union. And it was sort of the older brother and the younger brother, the two communist parties.
But the popularity of the communist movement at that time, how easily some people joined up with it, could that have been a backlash against, British imperialism at that point?
It's hard to say. I just. There was a previous Chinese regime, a dynasty that fell. There was the first revolution in 1911 that came up with the Republic of China.
Sun Yat-sen.
And
the Kuomintang.
Yeah. And so, I think that the fact that the People's Republic of China was established with the Communist Party, it followed on the heels of this Chinese Civil War. So it was... two sides, two parties within China that were doing the fighting. And the Kuomintang then proceeded to move to Taiwan. And so that's why it's still the Taiwan Republic of China.
And they were nationalists.
Yeah.
They were nationalists.
So you know, ultimately, I think that the you know, the rise of the Communist Party in China, it had more to do with Stalin. It had more to do with Russia. You know, and I mean, you know, China could feel perhaps threatened by the imperial powers of the time, you know, back in the day. You know, but I don't think that it was explicitly a reaction to British.
Now, with China's great history of philosophical history, which I think we still probably see some of today with the Dalai Lama, is there room for a resurgence of that great philosophical history, that those thousands of years of wonderful thought that was China?
Yeah, well, the classics have not completely faded. You know, there's been a change to the writing system. In other words, there's such a thing as Chinese traditional, and then there's Chinese simplified characters, the written characters. The simplified ones were brought in under Chairman Mao. Okay, and it may have in part been to try to step away from history. But, you know, in other places, such as Taiwan, they kept the traditional. So, you know, all of the ancient classics can still be read in their original language, in Chinese. I don't think that we're getting away from that. In fact, I think, you know, there continues to be fascination for such things as Confucianism. And you know, that will never go away. And all of Chinese history is just this rich, long history of, you know, these dynasties, one after another. And I think that they're going to continue to study their history. You know, if Chairman Mao really wanted to wipe out memories of history, he failed. And you know,
which is often the way.
The thing is
that's
that
perhaps one of the great lessons of history is that you can't wipe out history.
Absolutely. Look at like St. Patrick in Ireland. He couldn't stamp out, you know, the ancient Gaelic tongue or anything else. You know, the British couldn't stamp it out. He wound up accidentally preserving a lot of Irish history. St. Patrick did. So.
Humanity. It's a lot better than sometimes we give it credit for.
You see, Chinese culture is not entirely under the thumb of Beijing, because, you know, Chinese is used in Malaysia and in Singapore and in Taiwan, and you know, there's the expatriate community, you know, around the world, so that, you know, the Chinese people and Chinese language exist even in let's call them free world flavors. You know, you know, there's a dance troupe that performs this spectacular at the time of Chinese New Year each year. They come around. In fact, they were in Hartford like last Thursday.
Wow.
And so, you know, you can go there, and it's a big show. In fact, I've taken in that show when it was at Radio City Music Hall. And it's kind of like, you know, when they do the spectacular for Christmas with the Rockettes and just a big show in Radio City Music Hall. Well, they can do the same thing with this, and it's Chinese, you know, classical, you know, dance and culture and classic music, and just a very colorful show that sort of displays, you know, just all this ancient Chinese culture, and they're working to keep that alive. You know, it's over the objection of the Communist Party, though. The show I just referred to is put on by the Falun Gong practitioners.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so in the show they'll actually put in some acts where you can watch persecution happening.
Oh my goodness.
All right, so they are, you know, chronicling China seriously, but they get, you know, pushback from the Communist Party. They'll the simple fact is that if it were up to the communists, that show wouldn't exist, and they would have their thumb completely on Chinese culture. But the world is a big place, and you know, the Beijing is not able to suppress the past, the history, the knowledge.
One of the most complicated things that I think is involved in these revolutions is, first of all, you know, everybody's got their aspirations on who they want to take Mubarak's place. You know, everybody's got their aspirations on who they want in when Iran's, you know, nutcase fails. You know, everybody's got their aspirations in. But likewise, there's, you know, resistance from those countries not wanting the interference of these other of us and other countries like Great Britain. At the same time, there's this complicated dance because, in a way, America's, using China as an example, we have a passion, like you said, for, like, everybody's fascinated by Confucianism. Everybody's fascinated by Feng Shui. All these, you know, these specifically cultural things that Americans in other countries actually are fascinated by, that we actually help to preserve those cultures. So there's a complicated relationship between outside influence and the countries themselves, because it seems to be this mutual dance almost between
There is. But can I ask, in fact, or perhaps just because we didn't quite go to, if I can give you my take about the Egypt situation specifically, because you know, there's great reason for you know, to be enthused about what happened. You know, David was correct that Egypt was just able to do this revolution, and they did not have a Tiananmen Square. In other words, a bloodbath. You know,
Right.
The army did not
Right.
open fire on the protesters.
Right.
And so it may be that not every time a dictator wants to order his army to shoot the people, you know, that may not always be an order that goes through. It's more or less of, you would expect, you know, patriotic, or in the case of the Egyptian army, you know, it's drawn from everyone. I think there's a conscription in Egypt, so that you know, these soldiers are the common people.
Okay.
So now you're asking them what, to turn around and shoot the common people? It didn't happen. Okay. So the simple fact that they got through the phase that they just got through relatively peacefully, okay, was a good thing, and moves us more or less in that Gandhian direction.
Well, yeah, but I think there's one thing that must be kept in mind here. You know, we talked about Iran before. You know, in Iran, when you know, the fundamentalists took power, there was a wholesale purge of the army. Now, a lot of these generals, being from the Shah era, were killed or worse, you know, tortured and killed, and so on and so forth. You know, the Egyptian army, I'm sure, knows its history. And they're not going to want this revolution to fall prey to the Muslim Brotherhood, because I'm sure they're not going to want to go the same route as the Iranian army did. So I'm sure that that's one reason of trying to keep the people closer to them. I get your point about, but a lot of that's the lower officers, that kind of. The high-ranking officers were sops from Mubarak. I mean, so these guys are political realists.
Yeah.
You know, they are not going to let the Muslim Brotherhood take the show here, because they're afraid of what's going to happen. So obviously they're going to cater to the people as long as it's possible. Of course, I think one model I think that hasn't been talked enough about, you know, they'll say, well, is there a model for Arab democracy? Not necessarily Arab, Turkey. 1919, 1923, the Turkish War of Independence. Because when the British and the French in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement drew up their version of how the Middle East was going to look, you know, on the expectation of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire when the First World War was eventually over with, you know, they were going to carve that whole area up. But that was with the connivance of Imperial Russia. Now, when the Romanovs fell by the wayside and the Bolsheviks took over, well, now we got to go back to the drawing board. Then what they did was they went north, because now they didn't have, the French were supposed to get what we call Anatolia for the most part, and that was supposed to be a buffer zone to Russia. Well, now now Imperial Russia has fallen apart and the Bolsheviks have taken over. That's even worse. They're communists. So now we have to go back to the drawing board and write this new map. So they took it upon themselves to carve up Anatolia, which is now the homeland of modern Turkey. Britain got a slice, France got a slice, Italy got a slice of this, because that was a promise to the Italians for coming in onto the Allied side in 1915. They were supposed to get part of Turkey, and they were supposed to get Trieste in the Balkans, right?
Yep.
So they got slices. The Greeks were given a slice of Anatolia. This is where you get Armenia coming along. Armenia, Western Armenia, was supposed to be taken out of the carcass of Turkey. And then the Kurds. The Kurds were supposed to have at least some type of homeland here.
Who ended up in northern Iraq.
Well, they wound up in 4 different countries. You know, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. In fact, Turkey, they're not even called Kurds. They're called Mountain Turks. They're not even referred to really officially as Kurds.
But they're essentially the same culture?
It's the same thing, right. They just changed the name. However, the Turks rose up in 1919 because you had the San Remo Conference in 1920, which supposedly all these major powers agreed to this, and Japan was in on that conference. They weren't getting anything out of it, but they were in the conference anyway. And then the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which was supposed to solidify this agreement. Well, the Turks rose up. They killed Armenia, and then when that happened, because they had made a deal with Moscow, the Bolsheviks came down and took over eastern Armenia in the Caucasus. Armenia disappears. Kurdistan disappears. The British left, the French left, the Italians left, the Greeks got kicked out. So with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, you see Turkey now as it is. But the British continued to, and the French continued to draw up Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, which they called it then. And the situation is as you have it today. So if anything, you know, Kemal Ataturk led this revolution in Turkey. He did it with the army, and the army has been the protector of Turkish democracy all these years. So what I'm saying is maybe that's the model that the Egyptians should consider.
You see, wait,
Go ahead. Yeah.
because I had given you the first half of my take on Egypt.
Yeah.
You know, reasons to celebrate or to be enthused, but there's also reasons to be cautious, because consider
Very
this.
cautious.
What happens when you have a military coup against a military dictatorship? Does that mean that the regime has changed from military to military? All right, does that sound like change that you can believe in? All right, no. In fact, what just happened in Egypt was basically a military coup against a military dictator. So now, you know, they're not out of the woods. They totally have to pay attention to you know, the follow-through that the army needs to make to you know, bring to fruition the various reforms that it's promised. So,
Well, Suleiman is the one that's now running the place. And who was Suleiman?
Now,
He was
did
in charge of the intelligence
the
agency.
Egyptian military make a transition from being military, being more of a police force, just to keep things calm? Has that happened? Is that what happened?
No, I think now they've dissolved the parliament, and they've kind of taken the control of the government. I think at this point, when they sit down and talk to the people, they're going to have to make these. They're going to have to make. The people are going to have to meet the army halfway here.
Okay, we're going to stop right there. We're going to come back and do a second show and keep the conversation going. This is Progressive Soup. Gene Hislop and I, co-hosts. Mark Albertson and John Kusumi are our guests. We're having a great discussion about a great series of events taking place in the world. And we'll be back through the miracle of television in another few minutes.